The first thing you need to understand about coal mining is that it gets into everything. Your lungs, your skin, under your fingernails where it stays no matter how hard you scrub. It becomes part of you after 15 years underground like I've been. My name is Thomas Mitchell, and this is the story of how everything I thought was solid turned to dust. I'm 40 years old, though some days I feel twice that. The mine ages you fast, the constant darkness, the weight of all that earth above your head, the knowledge that every day you go down might be the day you don't come back up. But it's honest work, and it pays well enough to keep a roof over your head and food on the table in Millfield, West Virginia. Susan and I got married young. I was 22, she was 20. High school sweethearts, you might say, though we both knew this town didn't offer much in the way of romance or future prospects. She was pretty then, with auburn hair that caught the light and green eyes that seemed to hold secrets. I suppose they did hold secrets, just not the kind I imagined back then. For 18 years we had what I thought was a good marriage. Not perfect, mind you, no marriage is perfect. But we had our routines, our comfortable silences, our shared complaints about the weather and the neighbors. Susan kept house, managed our finances, tended a small garden out back where she grew tomatoes and green beans. I went down into the earth 6 days a week and came home tired and dirty, grateful for her cooking and her company. She never worked outside the home and I never asked her to. The mine paid enough for both of us and I liked the idea of her being there when I got home, having dinner ready, asking about my day. It felt traditional, stable. Looking back, maybe that stability was more fragile than I realized. The first envelope appeared on a Tuesday in March. I found it when I got home from my shift, propped against the front door like someone had just walked up and left it there. Plain white envelope, no return address, no name written on it. Just my address in block letters that looked deliberately disguised. Inside was a photograph. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. It was Susan, clearly recognizable despite the distance from which the photo was taken. She was standing outside Peterson's Hardware talking to someone. The someone was Joe Brennan, a guy I knew by sight but had never really spoken to. Joe was maybe 10 years younger than me, with sandy hair and the kind of easy smile that probably worked well in retail. The photo itself wasn't particularly damning. Two people talking outside a store, could be anything. Could be directions, could be small talk about the weather. But something about it bothered me. Maybe it was the way Susan was standing, leaning in slightly like she was hanging on every word. Maybe it was the way Joe was looking at her, with an expression that seemed too intense for casual conversation. I showed the photo to Susan that evening after dinner. "What's this?" she asked, barely glancing at it. "Found it in an envelope by the front door. No name on it." She looked more carefully then and I watched her face. There was a moment, just a moment, where something flickered in her eyes. Surprise? Guilt? Fear? It was gone so fast I might have imagined it. "It's nothing," she said, handing the photo back to me. Joe was helping me figure out what kind of screws I needed for the loose cabinet door in the kitchen. "You remember I mentioned it last week?" I did remember her mentioning the cabinet door. And I remembered thinking I should fix it myself when I had time. But with work being what it was, time was always short. "Why would someone take a picture of that?" I asked. Susan shrugged, already turning away to clear the dinner dishes. "Probably just some kid playing with a camera. You know how these small towns are, people get bored, start making mysteries out of nothing." It made sense, I suppose. And I wanted it to make sense. The alternative, that someone was deliberately documenting my wife's activities, was too unsettling to consider seriously. But I kept the photograph. The second envelope arrived the following Thursday. Same handwriting, same plain white paper. This time there were 3 photographs, all taken on what appeared to be the same day, based on Susan's clothing. The first showed her going into Peterson's Hardware. The second showed her and Joe standing very close together near the paint display, his hand on her shoulder. The third showed them outside again, and this time there was no mistaking the intimacy of their posture. They weren't just talking, they were talking like people who had things to say that couldn't be overheard. I stared at those photographs for a long time after Susan went to bed that night. The house was quiet except for the old furnace cycling on and off and the distant sound of a train carrying coal cars through the valley. I sat at the kitchen table under the overhead light, trying to find innocent explanations for what I was seeing. Maybe Joe was helping her plan a surprise for me. Maybe she was helping him with something, a gift for his mother, advice about a girlfriend. Maybe the person taking these pictures was misinterpreting normal, friendly interactions. But even as I told myself these things, I could feel doubt settling into my chest like coal dust in my lungs. The next day I mentioned Joe Brennan casually over breakfast. "You know," I said, buttering my toast, "I was thinking maybe I should stop by Peterson's Hardware this week. That cabinet door is still giving you trouble, right? Oh, no need, Susan said quickly. I already took care of it. Joe ordered the right kind of hinges for me. Should be in by the weekend. That's nice of him. He's very helpful. Good customer service. There was something in her tone, a careful casualness that felt rehearsed. Like she'd been thinking about how to handle questions about Joe Brennan. The third envelope contained a photograph that made my hands shake. It was taken inside Peterson's hardware, clearly from a concealed position behind some shelving. Susan and Joe were in the back corner of the store, near the plumbing supplies where customers rarely ventured. Joe had his arms around her, and she was looking up at him with an expression I recognized but hadn't seen directed at me in years. It was the way she used to look at me when we were young, when everything between us was new and electric. They were kissing. Not a friendly peck, not a casual brush of lips. A real kiss, the kind that involves your whole body, the kind that says things about people that can't be taken back or explained away. I sat with that photograph for 3 hours that evening, waiting for Susan to come home from what she told me was a grocery run to the next town over. When she finally walked through the door at nearly 9 o'clock, I was still sitting at the kitchen table. Sorry I'm late, she said, setting down 2 small bags of groceries. Had to stop at 3 different places to find the right kind of flour for that bread recipe I wanted to try. I looked at the bags. One contained a loaf of store-bought bread, some milk, and a package of ground beef. The other held toothpaste and shampoo. Nothing that couldn't have been found at the grocery store right here in town. Susan, I said, and my voice came out rougher than I intended. We need to talk. She looked at me, then really looked, and I saw her notice the photograph on the table between us. For just a moment, her composure cracked completely. I saw fear, shame, defiance, and something else, something that might have been relief. How long? I asked. She sat down across from me slowly, like someone much older than her 38 years. It's not what you think, she said. How long, Susan? Tom, I can explain. How long? She was quiet for so long I thought she wasn't going to answer. Finally she said, 3 months. 3 months. I tried to think back over the past 3 months, looking for signs I had missed. Her increased attention to her appearance. The way she had started doing errands that took her out of the house more often. The subtle distance that had grown between us, so gradual I had attributed it to the natural evolution of a long marriage. Why? I asked. It's complicated. Make it simple. Susan looked down at her hands, clasped tightly on the table. Joe pays attention to me. He listens when I talk. He makes me feel like I matter. You matter to me. Do I? She looked up, and there were tears in her eyes now. When was the last time you really talked to me, Tom? Not about bills or groceries or whose turn it is to call the insurance company, but really talked? When was the last time you asked me what I was thinking about, or what I wanted, or how I felt about anything that mattered? I wanted to argue with her, but the words wouldn't come. Because when I tried to remember the last time we'd had that kind of conversation, I couldn't. That doesn't justify this, I said finally. No, she agreed. It doesn't. We sat in silence for a while. The photograph lay between us like evidence in a trial, which I suppose it was. Who's taking the pictures? I asked. I don't know. You must have some idea. I honestly don't know, Tom. Joe and I have been careful. We thought we were being careful. Careful. The word hit me like a physical blow. They had been planning this, strategizing, making deliberate choices to deceive me while I went about my life completely unaware. Do you love him? I asked. Susan was quiet for a long time. Then she said, yes. That single word changed everything. If she had said it was just physical, just loneliness, just a mistake, maybe we could have found a way through it. But love was different. Love meant she had been building a life in her mind that didn't include me. Love meant this wasn't just about what Joe could give her that I couldn't. It was about who she wanted to be, and that person wasn't my wife. What do you want to do? I asked. I don't know. That's not an answer, Susan. I know it's not an answer. But I don't know what I want. I love Joe, but I've been married to you for 18 years. This is my home, my life. I can't just throw it all away. You already did throw it away, I said. The moment you decided to kiss him. The moment you decided you loved him. The only question now is whether you're going to be honest about it. The fourth envelope arrived 2 days later, while Susan and I were still moving around each other like strangers in our own house, speaking only when necessary, sleeping in the same bed but maintaining careful distance. This envelope contained a note along with the photographs. She's planning to leave you, the note said in the same block letters as the address. Joe Brennan has been telling people he's got a woman ready to start a new life with him. They're looking at apartments in Charleston. She's been moving money out of your joint account a little at a time for 6 weeks. Check your bank statements. The photographs showed Susan at First National Bank at the ATM outside Peterson's Hardware, and standing with Joe outside a real estate office in Charleston that I recognized from their TV commercials. I checked our bank statements that afternoon while Susan was out on another one of her mysterious errands. Over the past 6 weeks, she had made 18 withdrawals of varying amounts, never more than $200 at a time, never enough to seem suspicious if you weren't looking for a pattern. But it added up to nearly $3,000. Our emergency fund, which we had built up over years of careful saving, was almost gone. That evening I confronted her with the bank statements. "You're planning to leave?" I said. It wasn't a question. Susan looked at the statements, then at me, and for the first time since this whole thing started, she seemed to realize that her secrets were completely exposed. "Joe thinks we should get a fresh start somewhere else," she said quietly. "With my money. It's our money, Tom. I've been managing this household for 18 years. I've earned—" "Stop." I held up my hand. "Just stop. Don't try to justify stealing from me on top of everything else. I wasn't stealing. I was trying to build something." "You were trying to build something with another man using money that I earned working underground 6 days a week for the past 15 years. Susan started crying then, but it felt manipulative rather than genuine. Like she was trying to make me feel guilty for confronting her about her own choices. "I never meant for it to happen this way," she said. "How did you mean for it to happen?" "I don't know. I thought maybe we could talk, maybe we could work things out, maybe you'd understand." "Understand what? That you fell in love with someone else and decided to plan a secret life with him using our savings? What exactly am I supposed to understand about that?" She didn't have an answer for that. The fifth envelope contained the most devastating photographs yet. Susan and Joe together in what was clearly a hotel room, and while the images weren't explicit, they left no doubt about what had been happening between them. But it wasn't the physical intimacy that hurt the most, it was the way Susan looked in those pictures. Happy. Radiant. More alive than I had seen her look in years. With Joe, she was the person she used to be when we were young. With me, she had become someone going through the motions of a life she no longer wanted. I realized then that the marriage had been over long before the first photograph arrived. The pictures weren't documenting the beginning of Susan's betrayal, they were documenting the end of whatever we had built together. Maybe that end had been inevitable. Maybe we had been growing apart so gradually that neither of us had noticed until it was too late to do anything about it. But that didn't make it hurt any less. The sixth envelope arrived on a Friday. Inside was a single sheet of paper with an address in Charleston and a date and time, Saturday, 2 p.m. apartment viewing. I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years and drove the 2 hours to Charleston. I found the address easily, a modest apartment complex called Riverside Gardens, the kind of place young couples move to when they're starting out together. I parked across the street and waited. At exactly 2 p.m. Joe's truck pulled into the parking lot. Susan was in the passenger seat. They got out holding hands, looking around with the excited energy of people planning a future together. A few minutes later, they emerged from the building with a woman in a business suit who was clearly a rental agent. They were smiling, pointing at things, discussing details I couldn't hear. They looked happy. They looked like a couple. I drove home and started packing Susan's things. When she came back that evening, all of her belongings were in boxes and suitcases stacked neatly in the living room. "Tom," she said when she saw them, "what are you doing?" "Saving us both some time," I said. The apartment in Charleston looked nice. "When are you planning to move in?" She stared at me, clearly trying to figure out how I knew about the apartment. "How did you? Does it matter? You've made your choice, Susan. You've been making it for months. I'm just helping you follow through. This isn't how I wanted this to happen. How did you want it to happen? Were you planning to have some conversation where you explained why you had to leave me for my own good? Were you going to promise we could still be friends? Were you going to tell me you hoped I'd understand someday? Tom, please." "I do understand," I said. "You fell in love with someone else. It happens. People grow apart, people change, people find connections they didn't know they were missing. What I don't understand is why you felt like you had to lie about it. Why you had to sneak around and steal money and make me feel crazy for noticing that something was wrong." Susan sat down heavily on the couch, looking suddenly exhausted. "I was scared," she said. "Of what?" "Of hurting you. Of losing everything. Of making a mistake. So instead you decided to hurt me anyway, just more slowly and dishonestly. I thought maybe I could figure out a way to manage everything. To not have to choose. You can't have both, Susan. You can't be married to me and building a life with Joe. You can't be trustworthy and sneaking around. You can't be honest and lying every day about where you're going and what you're doing." She was crying again, and this time it seemed real. "I know," she said. "I know I handled this badly. I know I hurt you. I know I should have talked to you instead of all this. Why didn't you? Because I knew that if I told you the truth it would be over. And I wasn't ready for it to be over. But it was already over, Susan. It was over the moment you kissed him. Everything since then has just been cleanup." We sat in silence for a while, surrounded by the boxes that contained the remnants of her life in this house. "I'll need a few days to find a place to stay," she said finally. "The apartment in Charleston is available immediately. Joe can help you move." "Tom?" "I filed for divorce yesterday," I said. "My lawyer says it should be straightforward since we don't have kids and we can agree on asset division. You can take half of what's left in our accounts after you pay back what you already took. The house is mine, it was in my family before we got married, and you signed a prenup." Susan looked surprised. "I forgot about the prenup." I didn't. The prenup had been my father's idea, not because he didn't like Susan but because he wanted to protect the family property that had been passed down through 3 generations of minors. At the time, Susan had signed it without question, probably because she never imagined we'd get divorced. "What about my car? It's in your name. Take it." "What about?" "Susan, I don't want to negotiate with you. I don't want to have long conversations about who gets what dishes or what's fair or what we both deserve. I want you to take your things and go be happy with Joe. That's what you want anyway. I never wanted to hurt you." "I know. But you did hurt me. And continuing to drag this out isn't going to unhurt me. It's just going to make everything worse." Susan left that night. Joe came to help her load her things into his truck, and I watched from the kitchen window as they carried box after box out of the house we had shared for 18 years. Joe looked uncomfortable, like he knew he was intruding on something private and painful. Susan looked relieved, like she was finally free to stop pretending. After they left, I sat in the empty house and tried to figure out what I was supposed to feel. Anger seemed too simple. Sadness seemed too self-pitying. Betrayal felt accurate but not complete. What I felt mostly was tired. The 7th envelope arrived the Monday after Susan moved out. Inside was a note that said simply, "I'm sorry this happened to you. You deserved better." No photographs this time, just those words in the same block letters that had been documenting the end of my marriage for weeks. I never found out who had been sending the envelopes. In a town as small as Millfield, it could have been anyone, a neighbor who saw Susan and Joe together, a customer at Peterson's Hardware, someone who worked at the bank and noticed the pattern of withdrawals. Maybe it was someone who liked me and thought I had a right to know what was happening. Maybe it was someone who disliked Susan and wanted to cause trouble. Maybe it was someone who just enjoyed other people's drama. It didn't matter really. Whoever it was had done me a favor, even though it didn't feel like a favor at the time. The divorce was finalized 3 months later. Susan got half of our remaining savings, which wasn't much after legal fees. She got her car and her personal belongings. I kept the house, the furniture, and my pension from the mine. She and Joe moved to Charleston, where he got a job at a larger hardware store and she found work as a receptionist at a dental office. I heard they got married 6 months after our divorce was final, in a small ceremony at a chapel near the state capitol. I hoped they were happy. I genuinely hoped that what they had found together was worth what it had cost both of them to get it. As for me, I went back to work. Back to the mine, back to the routine of going underground 6 days a week and coming home to an empty house. At first, the silence was oppressive. For 18 years, there had been someone else moving through these rooms, someone to talk to at dinner, someone to watch TV with in the evenings. The absence of that companionship felt like a physical presence at first, heavy and uncomfortable. But gradually, I adapted. I started cooking meals that I actually wanted to eat instead of meals that represented some compromise between my preferences and Susan's. I started watching documentaries about mining and history that Susan had always found boring. I started going to bed when I was tired and getting up when I was rested, without having to coordinate with someone else's schedule. I wouldn't say I was happier exactly, but I was more myself than I had been in years. About a year after the divorce, I started getting mail addressed to Susan at my house, catalogs, promotional flyers, the occasional personal letter from friends who hadn't heard about the divorce. I dutifully forwarded everything to her new address in Charleston, writing "Please forward" on the envelopes in the same careful block letters I had seen so many times before. It was only when I was addressing the 3rd or 4th piece of forwarded mail that I realized I was the one who had been sending the photographs. Not consciously, not deliberately, but some part of me had been documenting Susan's betrayal without my realizing it. The handwriting on the envelopes was mine, disguised but recognizably mine. The careful timing of the deliveries, the strategic revelation of information, the way each envelope had contained exactly what I needed to see to understand what was happening, it all made sense now. I must have been taking the photographs during my lunch breaks from the mine, or on my way home from work, or during the weekend errands that I ran alone while Susan was busy with her own mysterious activities. Some part of me had known what was happening before my conscious mind was ready to accept it, and that part of me had been gathering evidence, building a case, preparing me for the confrontation that was inevitable. I had been protecting myself from a truth I wasn't ready to face by feeding myself that truth in small, digestible pieces. I had been my own anonymous correspondent, my own mysterious informant. It was unsettling to realize how much my subconscious mind had been working without my knowledge. But it was also strangely comforting. It meant that some part of me had been looking out for my best interests even when I was too naive or too hopeful to do it consciously. The last envelope I sent to myself contained a note that said, "You're going to be okay." And I was. Not immediately and not easily, but eventually. I was okay. The mind work continued to be hard, dangerous, and exhausting, but it was also steady and well-paying, and it gave me a sense of purpose. There's something to be said for work that has clear objectives and measurable results. You go down, you extract coal, you come back up. Success is quantifiable. The challenges are straightforward even when they're difficult. I started dating again after about 18 months, nothing serious at first, just coffee with women I met at the grocery store or church or through friends. Most of them were divorced or widowed, women who understood something about starting over in middle age. We talked about our children or our jobs or our hopes for retirement. We compared stories about marriage and disappointment and the strange experience of rebuilding a life you thought was already built. Some of these relationships lasted a few weeks, some a few months. None of them became serious, but they reminded me that connection was still possible, that there were still conversations worth having and experiences worth sharing. I learned to cook properly, not just the basic meals I had thrown together during my bachelor years or the help I had provided with Susan's cooking, but real cooking with recipes and techniques and attention to flavor and presentation. I found that I enjoyed the precision of it, the way a dish could be improved with small adjustments to timing or seasoning. It reminded me of the work I did in the mine, where attention to detail could mean the difference between success and disaster. I started reading again, something I hadn't done much of since high school. History books, mostly, and biographies of people who had faced difficult circumstances and found ways to persevere. I read about coal miners in other parts of the country, other parts of the world, and I was struck by how similar the challenges were regardless of geography or time period. The work was dangerous and difficult everywhere, but the people who did it found ways to take pride in it, to build communities around it, to pass knowledge and traditions from one generation to the next. I thought about my father, who had worked in the mine for 35 years before black lung forced him to retire. He had died when I was 25, too young to appreciate the sacrifices he had made to provide for our family. I wished I could talk to him now, ask him how he had managed to stay committed to work that was so demanding, so risky, so underappreciated by the outside world. But I thought I was beginning to understand the answer. He had stayed committed because commitment itself had value, because keeping your word and doing your job and taking care of your responsibilities was its own reward, regardless of whether anyone noticed or appreciated it. Susan had left because I hadn't been enough for her, because our marriage hadn't provided whatever it was she needed to feel fulfilled and valued and excited about her life. And maybe she was right. Maybe I had become too comfortable, too predictable, too focused on the practical aspects of our relationship and not attentive enough to the emotional aspects. But I had also been faithful. I had been honest. I had worked hard to provide for us both, and I had never given her reason to doubt my commitment to our marriage. Those things hadn't been enough to save our relationship, but they were still valuable. They were still worth something. I continued to receive occasional updates about Susan and Joe through the informal network of gossip that connects everyone in small West Virginia towns. They seemed to be doing well in Charleston. Joe had been promoted to assistant manager at his hardware store. Susan had learned to use a computer at her job and was taking evening classes at the community college. They had bought a small house in a neighborhood with other young couples and had started talking about having children. I was genuinely glad to hear that they were happy. Whatever had been missing from Susan's life with me, she seemed to have found with Joe. And maybe that was how it was supposed to work out. Maybe some relationships are meant to last a lifetime, and others are meant to last until both people are ready for whatever comes next. I had loved Susan and I thought she had loved me at least for a while. But love isn't always enough to sustain a marriage through all the changes that people go through over the course of decades. Sometimes love changes too, becomes different from what it was at the beginning, and sometimes the new version isn't compatible with the old promises and expectations. 3 years after the divorce, I met Elena. She was a nurse at the regional hospital, 10 years younger than me, with dark hair and the kind of calm competence that comes from dealing with medical emergencies on a regular basis. We met when I was brought to the emergency room after a minor accident at the mine. Nothing serious, just some cuts and bruises from a piece of equipment that hadn't been properly secured. Elena cleaned my wounds and bandaged my cuts with an efficiency that was somehow also gentle. She asked about my work, not with the horrified fascination that most people showed when they learned I was a coal miner, but with genuine interest in the technical aspects of the job. She wanted to know about safety procedures and extraction methods and the geology of the coal seams we worked. I found myself talking to her longer than was strictly necessary for medical treatment, and when she suggested that I come back in a week to have the bandages changed, I agreed even though I could probably have handled it myself. When I returned the following week, she asked if I'd like to get coffee after her shift ended. Elena was different from Susan in almost every way. Where Susan had been focused on home and family, Elena was career-oriented and ambitious. Where Susan had been content with the routines and traditions of small-town life, Elena was curious about the world beyond West Virginia. Where Susan had needed constant reassurance and attention, Elena was self-sufficient and confident. But the most important difference was that Elena seemed to understand that relationships require active participation from both people. She didn't expect me to read her mind or guess what she needed. When something bothered her, she told me. When she was happy about something, she shared it. When she had concerns or hopes or plans, she talked about them openly. We had been dating for about 6 months when she asked me directly, "Are you still in love with your ex-wife?" It was a Sunday afternoon, and we were sitting on my front porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. Elena had spent the weekend at my house and we had fallen into an easy domestic rhythm, cooking together, reading the newspaper, working in the garden. "No," I said, and realized as I said it that it was true. "I don't think I am." "You don't think you are?" "I'm not in love with the person she became. I might still have feelings for the person she was when we were young, but that person doesn't exist anymore. Maybe she never really existed the way I remember her." Elena nodded thoughtfully. "Do you think you'll ever want to get married again?" "I don't know. Do you?" "Maybe. If I found the right person." "What would make someone the right person?" "Someone who was honest with me. Someone who wanted the same kind of life I wanted. Someone who could be a real partner, not just someone to share expenses and household chores with." "That sounds reasonable. What would you want?" I thought about it for a while, watching the light fade from the sky and listening to the distant sound of a freight train carrying coal toward the cities where it would be burned to generate electricity for people who had never seen a mine. "I'd want someone who understood that commitment means something," I said finally. "Someone who wouldn't give up on us just because things got difficult or boring or different from what we expected. Someone who would talk to me when problems came up instead of looking for solutions somewhere else." "That sounds reasonable too." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, and I realized that this was what I had been missing with Susan toward the end, the ability to be quiet together without the silence feeling empty or uncomfortable. Elena and I got married 2 years later, in a simple ceremony at the courthouse in Charleston. My brother was my best man, and Elena's sister was her maid of honor. We had dinner afterward at a restaurant overlooking the Kanawha River, just the 4 of us plus Elena's parents and my mother, who had driven down from Pittsburgh for the occasion. It wasn't the kind of elaborate wedding Susan and I had had 18 years earlier, with the white dress and the church service and the reception for 200 people. But it felt more real somehow, more focused on the actual commitment we were making rather than the celebration of the commitment. Elena moved into my house and we began the process of building a life together. She kept her job at the hospital and I continued working at the mine. We talked about everything: work, money, family, politics, dreams for the future. When disagreements came up, we addressed them directly instead of letting them fester. It wasn't always easy. Elena's work schedule was unpredictable, with night shifts and overtime that sometimes meant we went days without seeing much of each other. My work was physically demanding in ways that sometimes left me too tired to be good company. We had different ideas about how to spend money, how often to see our families, what kind of social life we wanted. But we worked through these differences by talking about them, by negotiating compromises, by remembering that we were on the same team even when we disagreed about tactics. 5 years into our marriage, the mine where I had worked for 20 years closed permanently. The coal industry was changing, becoming more automated and less profitable, and smaller operations like ours were being shut down in favor of larger, more efficient mines in other parts of the state. I was 45 years old, with skills that were specific to an industry that was disappearing and a pension that wouldn't be available for another 20 years. For the first time since Susan left, I felt genuinely afraid about the future. Elena and I spent many evenings that winter sitting at the kitchen table, spreading out job listings and financial statements and making calculations about how long our savings would last. The hospital where she worked was stable, but her income alone wouldn't be enough to cover all our expenses. I applied for jobs at other mines, but most of them were either closing or cutting back on staff. I looked into retraining programs for former miners, but many of them required moving to other states or spending months in school for jobs that paid significantly less than what I had been making underground. Finally, Elena suggested something that hadn't occurred to me. What if you started your own business? Doing what? You know more about construction and repair work than almost anyone I've ever met. You've been fixing things around this house and helping neighbors with their projects for years. People trust you and they know you do good work. It was true that I had always been handy with tools and machinery. Growing up in a mining family, you learned to fix things yourself because hiring professionals was expensive and they often didn't understand the specific challenges of maintaining houses and equipment in coal country. Over the years, I had helped friends and neighbors with everything from plumbing repairs to roof replacements to electrical work. I don't have the money to buy all the equipment I'd need, I said. You don't need to start big. You could begin with small jobs, handyman work, basic repairs. Build up a reputation and a client base. Buy equipment as you can afford it. The idea grew on me gradually. I started by taking on a few small projects for people I knew, fixing a leaky faucet for my neighbor, installing new windows for a friend from church, building a deck for Elena's coworker. Word spread, and soon I was getting calls from people I didn't know, referrals from satisfied customers. Within a year, I had more work than I could handle on my own. I hired 2 younger men who had also been laid off from mines, and together we formed Mitchell Construction. We specialized in the kind of practical, honest work that was needed in our community: home repairs, small additions, maintenance work for local businesses. The work was different from mining but satisfying in its own way. Instead of going underground every day, I was working above ground, in natural light, creating and repairing things that people could see and use. There was immediate feedback. When I fixed someone's steps, they could walk up them safely. When I repaired a roof, the family stayed dry during storms. When I built a new room, children had a place to play or study. Elena was proud of what I had built, and her pride meant more to me than I had expected. She would tell her co-workers at the hospital about projects I was working on, about customers who had called to thank me for solving problems that other contractors couldn't figure out. She understood that starting the business had required not just technical skills but also courage, the willingness to risk failure, to take responsibility for other people's satisfaction, to build something from nothing. 7 years after Susan left, I realized I rarely thought about her anymore. The betrayal that had once felt like the defining event of my adult life had become just one chapter in a longer story. The pain had faded to the point where I could remember our good years together with something approaching fondness, while still being grateful that our marriage had ended when it did. I learned eventually that Susan and Joe had divorced after 3 years of marriage. The details were vague, something about financial problems and Joe's drinking and Susan's dissatisfaction with life in Charleston. She had moved back to West Virginia, to a town about 50 miles from Millfield, where she worked as a manager at a clothing store and lived alone in a small apartment. I felt sorry for her when I heard this news, but it was the kind of abstract sympathy you might feel for a character in a book or a stranger in a newspaper story. Her choices and their consequences were no longer connected to my life in any meaningful way. Elena and I had been married for 8 years when she told me she was pregnant. We had talked about having children but had never made definite plans. She was 37, I was 47, and we had both assumed that if it happened, it would happen, and if it didn't, we would be content with just the 2 of us. But when Elena showed me the positive pregnancy test, I felt something I hadn't expected: pure, uncomplicated joy. Not the anxious happiness I remembered from my 20s, when every good thing came with worries about how long it would last or what might go wrong. This was different: the simple, immediate pleasure of knowing that Elena and I had created something together, that we were going to be responsible for raising a person who would carry parts of both of us into the future. Our daughter, Sarah, was born on a snowy February morning after a labor that lasted 14 hours. Elena was magnificent throughout the whole process, focused, determined, stronger than I had imagined anyone could be. When the doctor finally placed Sarah in Elena's arms, and I saw my wife's face transform with an emotion too complex to name, I understood something about love that I had never understood before. This was what Susan had been looking for, I realized. Not just romance or attention or excitement, but the sense of participating in something larger than herself, something that connected her to the future in a meaningful way. She had tried to find it with Joe, and apparently that hadn't worked either. Maybe she was still looking for it. But Elena and I had found it together, in the ordinary miracle of creating a family, building a business, maintaining a marriage through all the small challenges and adjustments that 21st century life required. Sarah was 2 years old when I got a letter from Susan. Not anonymous this time, her name and return address clearly written on the envelope, her handwriting unchanged from the thank you notes she used to write to my mother after Christmas visits. Dear Tom, the letter began. I know this letter is probably unwelcome, and I'll understand if you don't want to respond. But I wanted to tell you that I'm sorry for the way I ended our marriage. I handled everything badly, and I hurt you in ways that you didn't deserve. I've had a lot of time to think about what went wrong between us, and while I can't change what I did, I can at least acknowledge it honestly. The letter went on for 3 pages, detailing her regrets about the deception, the financial theft, the way she had made me feel crazy for noticing that something was wrong. She talked about her failed marriage to Joe, about the difficulties of starting over in middle age, about the loneliness that came from realizing that the grass on the other side of the fence wasn't necessarily greener, just different. I heard that you remarried and started a business and have a daughter, she wrote. I'm genuinely happy for you. You always deserved better than what I was able to give you. I hope your new wife understands what a good man she married. The letter ended with an invitation to call her if I ever wanted to talk, but no pressure to do so. I know you have a full life now, she wrote, and I don't expect to be part of it. I just wanted you to know that I understand what I lost when I lost you. I showed the letter to Elena that evening after Sarah was asleep. She read it carefully, then folded it and handed it back to me. What do you think? I asked. I think she's probably lonely, Elena said. And I think she's probably sincere about being sorry. People make mistakes, especially when they're unhappy and don't know how to fix their problems constructively. Do you think I should respond? Do you want to? I thought about it for a while. There was a part of me that was curious about Susan's life now, that wondered what lessons she had learned from her failed marriage to Joe and her current life alone. There was another part of me that felt sorry for her, that wanted to let her know I didn't hate her, that I understood she had been trying to find something she couldn't name rather than trying to hurt me deliberately. But there was also a larger part of me that felt complete without that conversation. The chapter of my life that included Susan was closed, and I had no desire to reopen it, even for the purpose of forgiveness or closure or understanding. No, I said finally. I don't think I want to respond. I don't wish her any harm, but I don't need to be in contact with her either. Elena nodded. That seems healthy to me. I put the letter in a drawer with other documents from that period of my life. The divorce papers, the photographs, the bank statements that had documented the end of my first marriage. They were part of my history, but they weren't part of my present. Sarah grew into a confident, curious child who loved to follow me around when I was working on projects around the house. She would sit in her high chair in the garage while I repaired tools, asking endless questions about why screws turned clockwise and how levels worked and where electricity came from. Elena joked that Sarah was going to be an engineer, but I thought she might be anything she wanted to be. She had inherited Elena's intelligence and determination, and she was growing up in a house where problems were solved through communication and effort rather than avoided or ignored. When Sarah turned 5, I realized that she had been alive for exactly as long as Susan and I had been divorced. The life I was living now, with Elena, with my business, with my daughter, was no longer the life I had built after my marriage ended. It was simply my life, the life I had chosen and continued to choose every day. I stopped thinking about those anonymous envelopes, about the person who had been documenting Susan's betrayal and delivering evidence to my doorstep. Whether it had been a concerned neighbor, a malicious gossip, or some version of myself that was wiser than my conscious mind, it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that the information had forced me to confront a situation that was destroying me slowly, and that confrontation had ultimately freed me to build something better. Mitchell Construction continued to grow. We had expanded to a crew of 6 full-time employees and were taking on larger projects, renovations, new construction, commercial work. I was making more money than I had ever made in the mine, and I was doing work that would last, that would be useful to people for decades. Elena had been promoted to head nurse in the emergency department, a position that came with more responsibility but also more regular hours. She was home most evenings now, and we had developed routines around dinner and bedtime stories and weekend family activities that felt as solid and reliable as anything I had ever built with my hands. On our 10th wedding anniversary, Elena and I went to Charleston for dinner at the same restaurant where we had eaten after our courthouse wedding. Sarah spent the night with Elena's sister, and we had the rare luxury of an entire evening to focus just on each other. Over dessert, Elena asked me the same question she had asked on my front porch all those years ago. "Are you happy?" "Yes," I said without hesitation this time. "Are you?" "Yes. But I want to ask you something else." "Okay." "Do you ever regret that Susan left you?" It was an unexpected question and I took some time to consider it seriously. "I regret how it happened," I said finally. "I regret the dishonesty and the financial theft and the way it made me doubt myself. I regret that we couldn't figure out how to end our marriage honestly if it needed to end." "But do you regret that it ended?" "No. If Susan hadn't left, I never would have met you. Sarah wouldn't exist. I'd probably still be working in the mine, assuming it hadn't closed anyway. I'd still be married to someone who didn't really want to be married to me, and I'd probably never have realized that there was anything wrong with that." Elena smiled. "I've never told you this, but sometimes I feel grateful to Susan." "Grateful?" "She gave up something wonderful without realizing what she had. Her loss was my gain." "You think I'm wonderful?" "I think we're wonderful together. I think what we've built is wonderful. I think Sarah is wonderful. I think the life we're living is everything I ever wanted, even though I couldn't have imagined it before I met you." That night, lying in bed in the hotel room, I thought about the different kinds of love I had experienced. The young, intense love I had felt for Susan, full of passion and promise and blind hope. The mature, comfortable love that our marriage had settled into, based more on habit and shared history than on active choice. The desperate, possessive love I had felt when I realized she was leaving, when I was trying to hold on to something that was already gone. And now this, the daily, deliberate love I felt for Elena, built on mutual respect and shared goals and the thousand small kindnesses that accumulate over years of living together. It wasn't as dramatic as what I had felt at 22, but it was more reliable, more satisfying, more real. I understood now why Susan had needed to leave. Not because I was a bad husband or because our marriage was terrible, but because she had been looking for something that felt alive and electric and new. She had found that temporarily with Joe, but apparently it hadn't lasted. Maybe that kind of intense, romantic love couldn't last, at least not without something deeper to support it. What Elena and I had wasn't just passion, it was partnership. We were building something together. A family, a business, a life that could withstand difficulties and changes and the ordinary challenges that come with growing older. We were committed not just to staying married but to staying happily married, to continuing to choose each other even when that choice required effort. 15 years after Susan left, Millfield was a different place. Many of the mines had closed and younger people were moving away to find work in other industries. The town was smaller, quieter, marked by the empty houses and shuttered businesses that signaled economic transition. But there were also signs of resilience and adaptation. Some of the former miners had started small businesses like mine. Others had retrained for jobs in healthcare or education or technology. The community had rallied around its school system and its volunteer fire department and its annual festivals, recognizing that these institutions would be crucial for attracting young families who might choose to stay or move back. Elena and I had talked about moving to a larger city where there might be more opportunities for Sarah, more cultural activities, more diverse job prospects. But we had decided to stay. This was home with all its limitations and all its possibilities. This was where we had built our life together, where Sarah's grandparents lived, where my business was established, where Elena's expertise was needed at the hospital. Sarah was now 7 years old, tall for her age and curious about everything. She was learning to read chapter books and had developed a fascination with astronomy that kept us all awake past bedtime looking at stars and planets through the telescope Elena had bought her for Christmas. She was also showing signs of inheriting my mechanical aptitude. She could take apart and reassemble her bicycle with confidence, and she often helped me with simple tasks when I was working on construction projects. "Will Sarah ever meet your first wife?" Elena asked me one evening while we were washing dishes after dinner. It was an odd question and I wasn't sure what had prompted it. "I don't think so," I said. "Why?" "She asked me today what happened to the lady you were married to before me." "What did you tell her?" "I told her that sometimes married people decide they aren't right for each other, and they get divorced so they can try to find better matches. I told her that your first marriage ending was one of the reasons you and I were able to find each other." "That's a good way to explain it." But she wanted to know if the lady was nice, and if you were sad when she left and whether she might come back someday. I dried a plate slowly, thinking about how to answer questions I wasn't sure I understood myself. Susan was nice in some ways, I said finally. She wasn't cruel or mean-spirited. She was just confused about what she wanted. And I was sad when she left, but it was the right thing for both of us, even though I didn't understand that at the time. And she won't come back? No. She won't come back. Our marriage is over and it's going to stay over. You and Sarah are my family now. That seemed to satisfy Elena, but it got me thinking about how we explain our past to our children, how we help them understand that adults make mistakes and learn from them, that families can be formed and reformed, that love can end and begin again. I realized that Sarah would grow up with a very different understanding of marriage than I had had. She would know that people could choose to leave if they were genuinely unhappy, but she would also see, every day, an example of two people who chose to stay and work through difficulties together. She would understand that commitment was valuable but also that it had to be mutual, active, and honest to mean anything. On my 50th birthday, Elena threw me a surprise party. She had invited my employees and their families, neighbors, friends from church, people whose homes or businesses we had worked on over the years. The house was full of people who knew me as I was now, as Elena's husband, Sarah's father, the owner of Mitchell Construction, a member of this community who had found ways to contribute and belong. Looking around the room that night, I realized that very few of these people knew anything about my first marriage. They might know that I had been married before, but they didn't know the details of how it had ended or how it had affected me. They knew me as the person I had become, not as the person I had been when Susan left. That felt like a kind of grace, the opportunity to be known for who you are now rather than who you were during your worst moments or your most difficult periods. Late that night, after everyone had gone home and Sarah was asleep and Elena and I were cleaning up the remnants of the party, I found myself thinking about those anonymous envelopes again. Whoever had sent them, neighbor, enemy, or some version of myself I didn't understand, had given me information I needed but couldn't have obtained on my own. Without those photographs, I might have spent months or years trying to save a marriage that was already over, trying to fix problems that weren't fixable, trying to hold on to someone who had already decided to leave. The envelopes had forced me to confront reality instead of avoiding it, and that confrontation had ultimately set me free. I had learned something important from that experience. Sometimes the truth is painful but necessary, and avoiding it doesn't make it less true. It just makes it more destructive. In my marriage to Elena, I tried to apply that lesson. When problems came up, we addressed them directly. When feelings were hurt, we talked about them. When decisions needed to be made, we made them together with all the information available to both of us. It wasn't always easy or comfortable, but it was honest. And that honesty had created the kind of trust and intimacy that I had never experienced before, not even in the early years with Susan when everything seemed perfect. 2 months after my 50th birthday party, I got a phone call from someone I didn't recognize. "Mr. Mitchell? My name is David Chin. I'm a reporter with the Charleston Gazette-Mail. I'm working on a story about the economic transition in coal mining communities, and I'd like to interview you about your business if you have time." I agreed to meet him at the office Elena and I had established for Mitchell Construction in what used to be a hardware store downtown. David Chin turned out to be a young man, probably in his early 30s, with the earnest manner of someone who took his work seriously. He asked thoughtful questions about the challenges of starting a business in a declining economy, about the skills that transferred from mining to construction, about the prospects for small towns like Millfield as traditional industries disappeared. "What I'm really trying to understand," he said toward the end of our conversation, "is how people reinvent themselves when their whole way of life disappears. You spent 20 years working underground, and then suddenly you had to figure out how to do something completely different. How do you psychologically make that transition?" It was a good question and I thought about it for a while before answering. "I think you have to separate your identity from your job," I said finally. For a long time I thought I was a coal miner. That was who I was, not just what I did. When the mine closed, I felt lost because I didn't know who I was supposed to be. How did you figure it out? I realized that I wasn't really a coal miner. I was someone who solved problems and built things and took care of his responsibilities. Those skills could be applied to mining, but they could also be applied to construction or other kinds of work. The important thing was to focus on what I could do, not on what industry I could do it in. And personally, how do you handle that kind of major life change? I thought about Susan, about the divorce, about the way that loss had ultimately led to Elena and Sarah and the life I was living now. You have to be willing to let go of the life you planned and embrace the life you actually have, I said. Sometimes the life you actually have is better than the one you planned, but you can't discover that if you're holding too tightly to your original expectations. When the article was published a few weeks later, I was surprised to see that the reporter had used that quote as the headline, "Embracing the Life You Actually Have." Elena cut out the article and posted it on the refrigerator next to Sarah's school drawings and our family photos. "I'm proud of you," she said when she saw me reading it. "For what?" "For building something good out of something difficult. For not letting what happened with Susan make you bitter or afraid of trusting someone else. For being brave enough to start over." That evening, sitting on the same front porch where Elena and I had talked about love and commitment all those years ago, I realized that my story wasn't really about betrayal or divorce or anonymous letters. It was about resilience, about the human capacity to adapt and rebuild and find new sources of meaning when old ones disappear. Susan had left because she needed something I couldn't give her. The mine had closed because the economy was changing in ways that individual workers couldn't control. These were losses, and they had been painful, but they had also created opportunities for growth and change that wouldn't have existed otherwise. I had learned to build a different kind of marriage, based on communication and mutual support rather than assumption and routine. I had learned to build a different kind of career, based on entrepreneurship and community service rather than industrial employment. I had learned to build a different kind of family, one that was chosen and created rather than simply inherited. Sarah came out onto the porch with a book about space exploration that she wanted me to read to her before bedtime. As we sat together looking at pictures of distant planets and talking about the possibility of life beyond Earth, I thought about how much my world had expanded since the dark days after Susan left. Then, my world had felt small and constrained, limited by betrayal and loss and the fear that I would never be able to trust anyone again. Now it felt vast and full of possibility, shaped by love and partnership and the daily miracle of watching a child discover how much there was to learn about everything. "Dad," Sarah said looking up from the book, "do you think there are people living on other planets?" "I don't know," I said. "What do you think?" "I think there probably are, but they might be so different from us that we wouldn't recognize them as people." "That's an interesting idea. Like maybe they don't need houses or families or jobs like we do. Maybe they have completely different ways of living." I thought about that as we finished the book and I tucked Sarah into bed and kissed her goodnight. Different ways of living, different ways of loving, different ways of finding meaning and connection and purpose. Susan had needed a different way of living than what she had with me. Joe had apparently needed a different way of living than what he could build with Susan. Everyone was searching for something: love, security, excitement, purpose, understanding, but we all had different ideas about where to find those things and how to hold on to them once we found them. I had been lucky enough to find with Elena a way of living that satisfied both of us. Not perfect, no marriage is perfect, but sustainable, honest, and fulfilling in ways that continued to surprise me even after more than a decade together. As I turned off the lights and locked the doors and prepared for bed, I thought about the anonymous letters one more time. Whoever had sent them had probably thought they were doing me a favor by showing me the truth about my marriage. And they were right, the truth had been a gift even though it hadn't felt like one at the time. But the real gift hadn't been the information about Susan's betrayal. The real gift had been the opportunity to build something better with someone who wanted to build it with me. In the bedroom, Elena was already asleep, curled on her side with one hand under her pillow. I watched her for a moment in the dim light from the hallway, thinking about how different this was from those last months with Susan, when we had shared a bed but not much else, when we had been moving through the motions of intimacy without any of its substance. This was real. This was chosen. This was built on a foundation of trust and communication and shared commitment that could weather difficulties and changes and the ordinary challenges that came with building a life together. I climbed into bed carefully, trying not to wake Elena, and lay there listening to her breathing and thinking about how many things had to go exactly right for us to find each other. If Susan hadn't left, if the mine hadn't closed, if I hadn't injured myself and ended up in the emergency room where Elena worked, if either of us had been different people with different needs and desires, any of those variables could have changed everything. But they hadn't changed. They had all aligned in exactly the right way to bring us together and give us the opportunity to build something that neither of us could have built alone. I fell asleep that night feeling grateful, for the pain that had taught me what I really needed, for the losses that had cleared space for better things to grow, for the courage to start over when starting over felt impossible. The next morning, Sarah woke me up by climbing into bed between Elena and me, the way she did most weekend mornings. She was holding the space book we had read the night before and wanted to tell us about a dream she'd had about visiting Mars. There were people there, she said excitedly, but they were made of light instead of skin and bones. And they lived in crystal caves that sang when the wind blew through them. And they knew how to fly without spaceships. Elena and I listened to the elaborate details of Sarah's dream, asking questions and marveling at her imagination, and I realized that this was exactly the kind of Saturday morning I had hoped for when I married Elena. Not dramatic or extraordinary, just peaceful and warm and full of the small pleasures that make ordinary life feel meaningful. Later, after breakfast, while Sarah was playing in the backyard and Elena was reading the newspaper, I found myself looking through the drawer where I kept the documents from my first marriage. The divorce papers, the bank statements, the photographs that had documented the end of my relationship with Susan. I realized I didn't need them anymore. They had served their purpose, helping me understand what had happened, providing evidence for the legal proceedings, reminding me of lessons I needed to learn about trust and communication and the importance of facing difficult truths. But I didn't need to keep carrying them forward into the life I was building now. I gathered all the papers and photographs, put them in a metal trash can in the backyard and burned them. Sarah watched with interest as the flames consumed the last physical reminders of that chapter of my life. "What are you burning, Dad?" she asked. "Just some old papers I don't need anymore," I said. "Why did you keep them if you didn't need them?" "Sometimes it takes a while to figure out what you need and what you don't need. Sometimes you have to hold on to things for a while before you're ready to let them go." Sarah nodded solemnly as if this made perfect sense to her. Then she went back to playing with the dog we had rescued from the animal shelter the previous year, and I went back to planning the deck expansion that Elena and I wanted to add to the back of the house. That afternoon, while Elena was at the grocery store and Sarah was napping, I sat down at my computer and started writing. Not a letter or a report or anything that anyone else would ever read, but just thoughts about the past 15 years, about the journey from betrayal and loss to love and partnership and family. I wrote about the anonymous envelopes and the photographs they contained. I wrote about the confrontation with Susan and the painful process of divorce. I wrote about the fear and uncertainty of starting over at 40, about the challenges of building a new career and learning to trust someone again. I wrote about meeting Elena and falling in love in a completely different way than I had loved before. I wrote about Sarah's birth and the overwhelming joy of becoming a father. I wrote about the satisfaction of building a business that served my community and provided good work for my employees. I wrote until the sun was setting and Elena was calling me to dinner, and then I saved the document and closed the computer. I didn't know if I would ever return to what I had written, but the process of writing it had helped me understand something important about my own story. It wasn't a story about betrayal or divorce or loss. It was a story about transformation, about the way human beings can adapt and grow and create new possibilities even when their old assumptions about life prove to be inadequate. Susan's betrayal had been real and painful, but it had also been the catalyst for changes that had ultimately improved my life in ways I couldn't have imagined. The mine closure had been economically devastating, but it had forced me to discover entrepreneurial abilities I didn't know I possessed. The years of loneliness and uncertainty had been difficult, but they had prepared me to appreciate and contribute to the kind of partnership Elena and I had built together. Every loss had contained the seeds of something better, but only if I was willing to do the work of planting and tending and waiting for new growth to appear. That night, after Sarah was asleep and Elena and I were sitting together on the couch watching a movie, I told her about burning the documents from my first marriage. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Free," I said. "Like I finally finished something that needed to be finished." "Good. You don't need to carry that around anymore." "No, I don't." We sat quietly for a while and then Elena said, "I love the life we've built together." "So do I. I love that Sarah will grow up seeing what a good marriage looks like." "I love that too. And I love that you were brave enough to trust someone again after what Susan did to you. I love that you were patient enough to wait for me to figure out how to do that." The movie played on, but we weren't really watching it anymore. We were just sitting together, appreciating the ordinary miracle of a Saturday evening at home with our daughter sleeping safely upstairs and our future stretching out before us full of possibilities we would discover together. 15 years after those anonymous envelopes had arrived at my door, documenting the end of one life and the beginning of another, I finally understood what the last note had meant. "You're going to be okay." I was more than okay. I was happy, fulfilled, surrounded by love and meaningful work and the daily satisfactions of a life built on honesty and commitment and mutual care. The anonymous letter writer, whoever they were, had been right. I had survived the betrayal and the loss and the fear and the uncertainty. I had learned to trust again, to love again, to build again. And in building this new life, I had discovered something that the writer of those letters probably hadn't intended to teach me. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be preparation for the best thing that happens to you. Susan's betrayal had ended our marriage, but it had also freed me to find Elena. The mine closure had ended my career, but it had also enabled me to start my own business. The loneliness and uncertainty had been painful, but they had taught me to appreciate partnership and stability in ways I never could have appreciated them without experiencing their absence. I fell asleep that night thinking about Sarah, about the woman she would become, about the choices she would make and the challenges she would face. I hoped that she would never experience the kind of betrayal that had shattered my first marriage, but I also hoped that if she did face serious difficulties, she would remember that people can survive devastating losses and build something better from the pieces. I hoped she would understand that love is a choice you make every day, not just a feeling that happens to you. I hoped she would know that honest communication is more important than avoiding conflict. I hoped she would have the courage to face difficult truths instead of living with comfortable lies. Most of all, I hope she would remember that setbacks and losses and even betrayals don't have to define your story. They can be chapters in your story, but they don't have to be the ending. The ending, I realized as I drifted off to sleep next to my wife in the house we had made into a home, was still being written. Every day, Elena and I and Sarah were adding new pages to a story that none of us could have imagined when we started, a story of love and trust and the possibility of building something beautiful from the ruins of something that had seemed like it might last forever but hadn't. And that was exactly as it should be. Thank you for listening to my story. If you had a similar experience, share it in the comments. And also subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos.